The steel door groaned on its hinges, and cold October light fell across a concrete floor Robert Hayes had not seen touched by sunlight in 19 years. He stood in the doorway of the New Hampshire State Prison, a small canvas bag holding the whole of his belongings gripped in one trembling hand. And for a long moment he did not move at all, unable to trust that the open gate before him was anything but another cruel trick of a place that had taken nearly 2 decades of his life for a crime he had never committed. Somewhere behind him, a guard called his name, telling him it was time to go. Robert Hayes took one step forward onto ground that was, for the first time since 1979, no longer a prison zone. And then he stopped again, uncertain after 19 years, exactly how a free man was even supposed to walk. Before we proceed deeper, please consider subscribing to Calis-Crime Vault if you haven't. And hit like too. It's truly appreciated and helps me to keep creating similar and interesting cold case stories. Back to the story. The city of Laconia, New Hampshire sits along the shores of Lake Whitcomb in the heart of the state's lakes region, a community of tidy mill town streets and church steeples where, in the autumn of 1979, the textile and shoe factories that had built the city a century earlier still provided steady, if increasingly uncertain, work for much of the surrounding population. Founded in the early 19th century along the falls of the Winnipesaukee River, Laconia had grown by the late 1970s into a modest city of roughly 16,000 residents. Its downtown lined with the same brick mill buildings and Victorian storefronts that had defined the community for generations, a place where 3 generations of the same family often still lived within a few blocks of one another, and where the changing seasons around the surrounding lakes shaped the entire community's rhythm every bit as much as the ordinary business of work and family. The city's identity had always been closely tied to its lakes and its manufacturing heritage in equal measure, drawing summer visitors to its shores each year, even as its mills and factories provided the steady, generational employment that anchored the community's own year-round population, a dual character that gave Laconia a particular resilience even as the broader New England manufacturing economy began its own gradual decline throughout the decades that followed. Diane Whitcomb was 24 years old that October, a bright, well-liked young woman who worked as a clerk at a downtown department store and lived alone in a modest second-floor apartment on Church Street, a short walk from the shops and diners where she had grown up as a familiar and cheerful face. Colleagues at the department store remember Diane as a naturally warm presence on the sales floor, someone who took genuine interest in the regular customers who came through her register week after week, often remembering small personal details about their lives that made even routine transactions feel like a genuine, friendly exchange. Her supervisor at the store later described her as one of the most naturally gifted employees he had encountered in his own decades of retail management. Someone who seemed to understand instinctively that good customer service was ultimately about genuine human connection rather than mere transactional courtesy, a quality that had already led store management to consider Diane a strong candidate for eventual promotion into a supervisory role of her own. She had grown up in Laconia, the daughter of a mill supervisor and a homemaker, and had recently begun taking evening classes at the local community college, working toward a degree in business administration that friends said reflected her quiet, determined ambition to build a life beyond the modest expectations of the mill town where she had been raised. Diane's community college instructor in her business courses later recalled her as one of the most conscientious students in his evening classes, often arriving straight from her department store shift still in her work clothes, exhausted but unfailingly engaged. A dedication, he said, reflected a young woman genuinely determined to build something more for herself despite the practical demands of working full-time while pursuing her education. Diane's older sister later recalled that Diane had spoken often in the months before her death about her hopes of someday managing her own small shop in downtown Laconia, a modest but genuine dream she had begun actively planning toward through her coursework and her careful savings. a future that October night in 1979 would permanently and senselessly erase. Diane's sister, who had remained close to her parents throughout the following 2 decades, later said that the family had marked Diane's birthday every single year with a quiet visit to her grave, a ritual that continued unbroken through both the original conviction and the eventual painful discovery of the true circumstances of her death nearly 20 years later. She has said that the family now marks 2 dates each year, Diane's birthday and the anniversary of Walter Pruitt's conviction, treating both as meaningful if very different, occasions worth honoring in their own quiet way. On the night of October 4th, 1979, Diane failed to appear for her scheduled shift the following morning, and when a concerned coworker went to check on her, she was found dead inside her own apartment, the victim of a violent assault that had occurred sometime during the previous evening. That coworker, a young woman named Marie Fontaine who had worked alongside Diane at the department store for nearly 2 years, later told investigators that she had grown concerned when Diane failed to answer the telephone that morning. An unusual break from Diane's normally punctual and reliable habits that prompted Marie to walk the short distance to Church Street during her own lunch break to check on a friend directly. Marie would carry the memory of that discovery for the remainder of her own life, later telling a reporter that the particular devastating stillness of the apartment, so at odds with Diane's normally lively and welcoming presence, had struck her immediately as something far more serious than a simple misshift. Marie remained close friends with Diane's family throughout the following 2 decades, attending the original 1980 trial faithfully and later, following Robert Hayes' exoneration, telling a reporter that she had never once doubted the original verdict until the DNA evidence proved otherwise, a common sentiment among many long-time Laconia residents who had trusted the original investigation's conclusions without ever imagining they might prove so profoundly mistaken. The Laconia Police Department responded swiftly, and Detective Carl Boudreau, a veteran investigator known across the department for his determined, occasionally impatient approach to closing difficult cases, took personal charge of the investigation within hours of the discovery. Detective Boudreau had built a considerable reputation across his 18 years with the department for his ability to close cases quickly, a skill much admired by his superiors, but one that colleagues in later years would come to recognize had sometimes come at the cost of the more patient, methodical thoroughness a case of this magnitude truly required. Boudreau conducted the majority of Robert's initial interrogation personally, employing an aggressive, confrontational style common to the era, one that modern interrogation training would later recognize as prone to producing false confessions and inconsistent statements from innocent suspects overwhelmed by sustained pressure and fear rather than any genuine consciousness of guilt. The pressure to solve the case quickly was immediate and considerable. A young woman's brutal murder inside her own home striking fear across a close-knit community unaccustomed to violence of this kind. And Detective Boudreau, working under that pressure, began building a case with a speed that would, nearly 2 decades later, prove to have come at a devastating cost. Robert Hayes was 32 years old that autumn, a construction worker who had moved to Laconia only the previous year from Manchester, taking on framing and roofing work wherever the seasonal trade offered it. A quiet, somewhat solitary man who had briefly dated Diane Whitcomb earlier that same year, a relationship that had ended, by all accounts, amicably several months before her death. Robert had grown up in Manchester, the son of a shoe factory worker, and had drifted between construction jobs across southern and central New Hampshire throughout his 20s, a transient working life that, while entirely ordinary for a tradesman of that era, would later be characterized at trial in ways that cast an unfair and misleading shadow over his character. Friends from his years in Manchester later described Robert as a quiet, hard-working young man who had never once been in serious trouble with the law, a single minor disturbance charged from his early 20s, long since resolved without incident, the only blemish on an otherwise unremarkable record that prosecutors nonetheless emphasized the trial in ways his own attorney was unable to adequately contextualize for the jury. Robert had been seen near Diane's apartment building on the evening of the murder by a neighbor who recognized him from his earlier visits during the brief relationship. A sighting that, combined with Robert's inability to produce any witness who could confirm his own account of having spent that evening alone at his rooming house, placed him at the center of Detective Boudreau's rapidly narrowing investigation within the first 48 hours. That neighbor, an elderly woman named Doris Fenwick who lived across the street from Diane's building, later admitted during cross-examination at Robert's original trial that she had only glimpsed a figure from a considerable distance in fading evening light. Testimony whose inherent uncertainty was, at the time, given far less weight by the jury than the confident certainty with which prosecutors presented it during closing arguments. Robert's own landlord at his rooming house, questioned during the original investigation, could not confirm with any certainty whether Robert had been present in his room that particular evening, a routine gap in memory common to any landlord managing a rooming house of transient tenant traffic, but one that, combined with Doris Fenwick's uncertain sighting, proved devastating to Robert's ability to establish any solid account of his own whereabouts. The case against Robert Hayes, built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, nonetheless proceeded with a momentum that Robert himself, then and for the following 19 years, insisted had never given serious consideration to any alternative explanation. A partial fingerprint recovered from Diane's apartment doorframe was matched, through an analysis techniques of the era, to Robert. A detail prosecutors would present at trial as damning despite the reasonable possibility, raised by Robert's own defense attorney but never fully explored, that the print could have been left during any one of Robert's earlier, entirely innocent visits to the apartment during his relationship with Diane months before her death. Robert's court-appointed attorney, a young and inexperienced lawyer handling only his second homicide case, later admitted in interviews decades afterward that he had lacked both the resources and the forensic expertise necessary to meaningfully challenge the prosecution's confident presentation of the fingerprint and hair evidence, a limitation common to many indigent defense cases of that era, but one that carried devastating consequences in Robert's particular circumstance. That same attorney reached for comment following Robert's eventual exoneration nearly 2 decades later, told a reporter that he had thought of the case periodically throughout the intervening years, always with a quiet, persistent unease he could never fully articulate at the time, but that Robert's eventual vindication, finally confirmed, had been entirely justified. A single hair recovered from the scene was described by the prosecution's forensic witness as microscopically consistent with Robert's own hair, testimony that carried considerable weight with the jury despite the inherent limitations of hair comparison analysis, a forensic technique that decades later would be widely recognized as far less reliable than juries of the era were led to believe. Robert's own inconsistent statements during police questioning, the natural product of an innocent but frightened man being interrogated for hours without legal counsel present, were presented at trial as evidence of a guilty conscience rather than the simple confusion and fear of a man who could not adequately account for an evening he had, in fact, spent entirely alone. Robert later described in interviews following his eventual exoneration the particular disorientation of that initial interrogation, recalling detectives who seemed already convinced of his guilt before he had said a single word, and a mounting panic that caused him to misremember small details of his own evening, inconsistencies that seemed trivial to him at the time but that prosecutors would later present to the jury as deliberate deception rather than the ordinary confusion of an innocent man under extraordinary pressure. He has said in his advocacy speeches that he did not fully understand, at the time, how devastating those small, innocent inconsistencies would ultimately prove at trial, believing naively throughout the initial interrogation that his own innocence would eventually become self-evident once investigators looked more carefully at the actual facts of the case. A faith in the system's basic fairness that his subsequent 19 years of wrongful imprisonment would force him to reconsider entirely. The prosecution also called several character witnesses who testified to a brief altercation between Robert and Diane some months prior to her death, a minor disagreement over the ending of their relationship that witnesses characterized at trial in far more ominous terms than the actual, relatively unremarkable disagreement had ever involved. Testimony Robert's own attorney was unable to adequately counter given his limited resources and experience. One such witness, a mutual acquaintance of both Robert and Diane, later admitted decades afterward, once Robert's exoneration became public, that she had genuinely believed at the time she was helping the prosecution understand a dangerous pattern of behavior, an honest, but ultimately mistaken impression she said she deeply regretted once she learned the full truth of what her testimony had helped contribute to. Robert Hayes was convicted of second-degree murder in the spring of 1980 and sentenced to a lengthy term in the New Hampshire State Prison, a conviction he protested from the moment of his arrest through every subsequent year of his incarceration, writing letters to newspapers, to legal aid organizations, and eventually to the New England Innocence Project once that organization began its work in the following decade, insisting always and without variation that he had never harmed Diane. Whitcomb and had, in fact, cared for her deeply even after their brief relationship had ended. At his original sentencing, Robert addressed the court directly, telling the judge in a trembling but steady voice that he had loved Diane and would never have harmed her, a statement the presiding judge acknowledged, but ultimately found insufficient to outweigh what he described at the time as the compelling weight of the physical evidence presented at trial. An assessment history would eventually prove tragically mistaken. Robert spent his prison years working in the facility's small library, a position he requested specifically because it gave him access to legal materials he studied obsessively in his own defense, teaching himself the fundamentals of criminal appellate law with a diligence that fellow inmates and prison staff alike came to respect over the years, even as his repeated appeals, filed largely without the benefit of formal legal training, were consistently denied by courts unwilling to overturn a conviction that had, on its surface, followed all the proper legal procedures of its time. The prison's head librarian, a woman who worked alongside Robert for over a decade, later told a reporter that she had never once, across all her years supervising inmates in that position, encountered anyone who approached self-directed legal study with quite the same relentless, discipline-focused Robert brought to his own case, filling notebook after notebook with careful legal research even as year after year of rejected appeals might reasonably have discouraged a less determined man. Entirely, his mother, Eleanor Hayes, became her son's most persistent advocate over the following years, visiting him faithfully at the prison every single month, regardless of the considerable distance from her own home in Manchester, and maintaining, across nearly 2 decades, an unwavering public insistence that her son had been wrongfully convicted, a conviction she carried with a quiet, exhausting determination that never once wavered even as year after year passed without any meaningful legal progress. Eleanor took a second job cleaning offices in the evening specifically to help fund whatever legal assistance she could afford for her son over the years, a sacrifice she never once complained of publicly, telling a reporter decades later that she had simply never allowed herself to consider any outcome other than her son's eventual vindication, regardless of how many years that vindication ultimately required. Eleanor also organized a small but dedicated letter-writing campaign among family, friends, and church members throughout the 1980s, encouraging them to write periodically to state legislators and newspaper editors on Robert's behalf, a grassroots effort that produced no immediate legal breakthrough, but that Eleanor maintained faithfully regardless, believing firmly that keeping her son's case in the public consciousness mattered even during the many years when no formal legal avenue seemed available to pursue. The Laconia community, in the years immediately following the trial, largely considered the case closed, Robert Hayes's continued protestations of innocence dismissed by most as the predictable, unremarkable claims of a convicted man unwilling to accept responsibility for his crime. Local newspapers that had covered the original trial extensively rarely revisited the case in the years that followed, and the small handful of Laconia residents who had known Robert personally during his brief year in town gradually moved on with their own lives, the case fading for most into the same settled category of local history as any other resolved tragedy. The Laconia Citizen ran a brief retrospective piece on the case each October throughout the 1980s, coverage that grew progressively shorter and less prominent with each passing anniversary as public interest in a case widely believed settled continued its ordinary, gradual decline. Diane Whitcomb's own family, her parents in particular, found what comfort they could in the belief that justice had been served, a belief that would, nearly 2 decades later, prove to have been built upon evidence far less certain than the courtroom of 1980 had been led to understand. Detective Boudreau himself retired from the department in the early 1990s, having considered the Whitcomb case one of the more straightforward successes of his long career, an assessment he would eventually be forced to reconsider in the most painful terms imaginable. Boudreau's own former colleagues later recalled that he spoke of the case periodically during his own retirement years, always with a certain quiet pride at having brought the investigation to a swift resolution, entirely unaware of the devastating error that resolution had actually represented. Detective Boudreau passed away in 2001, 2 years after Walter Pruitt's trial concluded, and colleagues who visited him in his final months later said he had spoken privately, with considerable anguish, about his own role in Robert Hayes's wrongful conviction, expressing regret that he had not pursued Walter Pruitt's inconsistent 1979 statement with the same rigor he had applied to building the case against Robert, a regret he carried, by all accounts, with genuine and lasting remorse through the final years of his own life. Now, before we continue further into the years that finally brought this case to a very different conclusion than anyone in 1980 could have imagined, take a moment, if the story has moved you, to subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next case we bring to light together, and turn on your notifications so you will be there the moment we return with more stories told with the care and the respect they deserve. Thank you, and let us return now to Laconia, and to a wrongful conviction that had waited 19 years to finally be undone. In the mid-1990s, as DNA testing technology advanced considerably beyond what had been available at the time of Robert's original trial, the newly established New England Innocence Project began reviewing a substantial backlog of cases involving convictions built primarily on forensic evidence, now understood to be considerably less reliable than juries of earlier decades had been led to believe. The organization, staffed largely by volunteer attorneys and law students working alongside a small number of dedicated forensic experts, prioritized cases where biological evidence had been preserved and where the original conviction had relied heavily on now discredited techniques such as microscopic hair comparison, criteria that made Robert Hayes's case an early and compelling candidate for review once his persistent letters finally reached the organization's attention. The Innocence Project's founding attorneys had modeled their approach on similar organizations that had begun emerging across the country throughout the 1990s, part of a broader national movement applying advancing DNA science to the difficult, often institutionally resisted work of re-examining decades-old convictions, a movement that would, over the following 2 decades, ultimately help exonerate hundreds of wrongfully convicted individuals across the United States. Robert Hayes's own persistent correspondence, maintained faithfully across nearly 15 years of incarceration, finally found its way to an attorney named Patricia Levesque, a dedicated advocate working with the Innocence Project who took on his case in 1996 after reviewing the original trial transcript and recognizing immediately the troubling reliance on forensic techniques that had, in the years since Robert's conviction, been substantially discredited within the broader scientific community. Patricia later said that Robert's own letters, written in a careful, articulate hand developed through his years of self-directed legal study in the prison library, struck her immediately as reflecting a genuine, sustained conviction of innocence rather than the more common, less consistent protestations she had encountered in other cases her organization had reviewed and ultimately declined to pursue. Patricia Levesque petitioned the Belknap County Court for access to the original physical evidence from the 1979 crime scene, evidence that fortunately had been carefully preserved within the State Police Evidence Archive across the intervening years, and after a lengthy legal process spanning nearly 2 additional years, was finally granted permission to submit the preserved biological samples for modern DNA analysis. The legal battle to secure this access proved considerably more difficult than Patricia had initially anticipated. The county prosecutor's office initially resistant to reopening a conviction that had, by every formal legal measure, already been thoroughly adjudicated and upheld through Robert's earlier unsuccessful appeals, a resistance Patricia attributed less to any bad faith than to the ordinary institutional reluctance any prosecutor's office feels toward revisiting its own past work. Patricia spent nearly a year and a half filing and refiling motions before finally securing a court order compelling the release of the preserved evidence, a process she later described as testing her own professional patience in ways few other cases in her career ever had, sustained throughout only by her growing conviction, based on her own careful review of the original trial transcript, that Robert Hayes' claims of innocence deserved far more serious consideration than the court's previous 2 decades had ever given them. She has since said that the case fundamentally shaped her entire subsequent approach to Innocence Project work, teaching her to never underestimate the sheer institutional inertia that can accumulate around even a deeply flawed conviction once it has been formally upheld through the ordinary appeals process. A lesson she has carried into every subsequent case she has taken on across her own long career. The testing, conducted by an independent forensic laboratory in the spring of 1998, returned a result that would, within months, completely upend everything the Laconia community had believed about the Whitcomb case for nearly 2 decades. The DNA profile developed from biological evidence recovered from the crime scene did not match Robert Hayes, a finding that excluded him definitively as the source of evidence prosecutors had once presented as central to his conviction. Patricia Levesque later described receiving the laboratory's report as one of the most profound professional moments of her entire career. Reading the exclusion result alone in her office late one evening and immediately understanding that 19 years of a man's life had been built upon a forensic foundation that modern science had just conclusively demonstrated to be entirely mistaken. She called Robert personally that same evening to share the news, and later told a reporter that hearing him fall completely silent on the other end of the line, unable initially to speak at all, remained one of the most emotionally significant moments of her entire legal career. A silence that spoke, she said, more powerfully than any words could have of 19 years of accumulated hope, disappointment, and finally, impossibly vindication. Robert Hayes was formally exonerated and released from the New Hampshire State Prison in October of 1998, 19 years, almost a month, after Diane Whitcomb's murder had first led to his wrongful arrest. His release drew considerable media attention across New Hampshire, a case that quickly became one of the state's most prominent examples of the growing national reckoning with wrongful convictions built upon since discredited forensic techniques. Reporters and television crews gathered outside the prison gates that October morning, and Robert later said he remembered almost nothing of the immediate press conference that followed his release, the entire day passing in a kind of disoriented blur after 19 years of anticipating a moment he had, in his most difficult years of incarceration, genuinely feared might never actually arrive. Robert's first meal as a free man, shared quietly with Patricia Levesque and his mother at a small diner not far from the prison, became a moment he would describe in numerous interviews over the following years. The simple, ordinary pleasure of choosing his own food from a menu striking him, after 19 years, as almost overwhelming in its unfamiliar freedom. He later said that he ordered eggs and toast, a breakfast he had eaten countless times in prison as well, but that the simple act of a waitress asking how he wanted them cooked, a small choice he had not been permitted to make for nearly 2 decades, brought him unexpectedly to tears in front of his own mother and attorney, a moment he has since described in his advocacy speeches as the instant he first began to fully understand the sheer scope of what 19 years of incarceration had actually taken from him. Patricia Levesque stood beside him throughout that first overwhelming day, later telling a reporter that she had never in her career witnessed anything quite like the particular mixture of joy and disorientation on Robert's face as he stepped, for the first time in 19 years, into a world that had continued on entirely without him. But the exoneration, however historic and long overdue, left an urgent and troubling question unanswered, a question that Patricia Levesque and the reopened investigation that followed would spend the following months working to resolve. If Robert Hayes had not killed Diane Whitcomb, then whoever had actually committed the crime had walked free for nearly 2 decades, never once identified or held accountable across all the years the wrong man had instead served in his place. Detective Sarah Kendrick, a young investigator only recently assigned to the Laconia Police Department's Small Cold Case Division, was given the reopened Whitcomb file in the weeks following Robert Hayes' exoneration, tasked with the difficult and sensitive work of identifying who had actually committed a murder the department had, for nearly 2 decades, believed conclusively solved. Detective Kendrick had joined the department 8 years earlier after beginning her career with the New Hampshire State Police, and had requested the transfer into cold case work specifically because of a long-standing professional interest in exactly the kind of patient, meticulous document review the assignment demanded, a skill set that would prove essential to unraveling a case that had, for nearly 20 years, rested upon conclusions no one had thought to seriously question. Colleagues who worked alongside her described a detective known for an unusually careful, deliberate approach to even routine casework, a temperament some found occasionally frustrating in the fast-paced demands of active patrol work, but that proved ideally suited to the patient, document-intensive nature of cold case re-examination when she finally found her way into that specialized role. She approached a reopened investigation with an acute awareness of its unusual sensitivity, understanding that her work would not only need to identify Diane Whitcomb's actual killer, but would also, inevitably, require confronting the department's own significant institutional failure in the original 1979 investigation, a dual responsibility she has since said weighed on her heavily throughout the entire process. Detective Kendrick briefed her own supervisor weekly throughout the re-examination, both to ensure proper institutional oversight and to document carefully every step of a process she understood would eventually face intense public and legal scrutiny given the case's extraordinary circumstances. Detective Kendrick approached the original 1979 case file with the same careful thoroughness that had, by the late 1990s, become standard practice for cold case re-examination, reading through every witness statement and every interview transcript rather than relying on Detective Boudreau's own original summary conclusions. It was during this careful review that Detective Kendrick made a discovery that would prove, in its own way, every bit as shocking as Robert Hayes' original exoneration. Among the dozens of witnesses interviewed during the original 1979 investigation was a man named Walter Pruitt, a co-worker of Diane's at the downtown department store who had, according to his own original statement, considered Diane a friendly acquaintance and nothing more. Detective Kendrick noted that Walter's interview, conducted only 3 days after Diane's murder, contained several small inconsistencies regarding his own whereabouts that evening, inconsistencies that Detective Boudreau's original investigation had never followed up on, having already, by that point, focused the entirety of the department's attention on Robert Hayes as the case's primary and, in Boudreau's own judgment at the time, sufficiently compelling suspect. Detective Kendrick found, digging further into the original file, that a co-worker of Walter's had mentioned in a separate and seemingly unrelated 1979 interview that Walter had confided a private infatuation with Diane in the weeks before her death, a detail that had been recorded in the original file, but never cross-referenced against Walter's own statement or pursued as a potential motive of any kind. Detective Kendrick located Walter Pruitt, now 47 years old and still living in the greater Laconia area, working for decades in the same downtown retail district where he had once worked alongside Diane Whitcomb, and requested a voluntary DNA sample as part of the department's broader effort to identify Diane's actual killer following Robert Hayes' exoneration. Detective Kendrick approached Walter carefully, framing the request as a routine step in the broader reinvestigation rather than revealing the specific suspicion his own decades-old interview had raised, a deliberate strategy designed to secure a genuinely voluntary sample before Walter had any opportunity to consider seeking legal counsel. Walter agreed to provide the sample without apparent hesitation, and the comparison, completed within several weeks, returned a match to the DNA profile developed from the original 1979 crime scene evidence, a result that finally, after nearly 2 decades, identified the man who had actually taken Diane Whitcomb's life. Confronted with the DNA evidence, Walter Pruitt's composure, maintained across nearly 2 decades of an ordinary, unremarkable life built quietly in the shadow of another man's wrongful conviction, finally began to give way. Detective Kendrick later described watching something visibly shift in him during the interview, his shoulders dropping, his hands, which had rested tensely on the table throughout most of the questioning, finally growing still as he stared down at the printed forensic report laid before him. In a halting, quiet voice, he told Detective Kendrick that he had, in fact, visited Diane's apartment on the evening of October 4th, 1979, admitting to a private infatuation with her that had grown steadily over the months they worked together, an attachment he insisted he had never openly expressed to her prior to that final, catastrophic evening. Walter described stopping by Diane's apartment under the pretense of returning a book she had lent him, and confessed that when he finally worked up the courage to express his feelings for her directly, Diane had gently but firmly explained that she did not share his interest, a rejection Walter claimed triggered a sudden, overwhelming shame and anger that led to the violence that followed, a violence he insisted, even in his own confession, he had never intended when the visit began. Investigators, reviewing Walter's account against the physical evidence recovered from the scene decades earlier, found the sustained, repeated nature of the assault Diane had suffered difficult to reconcile with Walter's own characterization of a single moment of uncontrolled panic. Evidence the prosecution would later argue reflected considerably more sustained violence than his account suggested. Walter maintained throughout his questioning that he had never once, across the following 19 years, spoken to another living person about what had actually happened that October evening, a silence he described as something he had simply learned to carry quietly alongside the ordinary business of his daily life, a burden, he said, had never fully lifted even as he watched, from the periphery of the community's own memory. Another man served nearly 2 decades in prison for a crime that was, in fact, entirely his own. Walter never married, continuing to live alone in a modest apartment not far from the same downtown district where he had worked for decades, a quiet, unremarkable presence that drew no particular scrutiny from neighbors or co-workers throughout all the years Robert Hayes remained wrongfully imprisoned for his crime. The formal arrest of Walter Pruitt took place quietly at his own apartment on a gray morning in late 1998, deputies arriving to find him seemingly resigned to the moment, offering no resistance as he was read his rights and led away. News of the arrest spread through Laconia within hours, and longtime residents later described a profound and disorienting shock moving through the community that week. A case they had believed closed for nearly 2 decades, suddenly reopening in the most devastating way imaginable. revealing simultaneously an innocent man wrongfully imprisoned and a true killer who had lived quietly among them the entire time. The case moved to trial in the autumn of 1999, and the Belknap County Courthouse filled the capacity throughout the proceeding. A community forced to reckon simultaneously with the historic wrongful conviction of an innocent man and the belated prosecution of the true culprit who had evaded justice for nearly 2 decades, while that innocent man served a sentence. Local and regional newspapers covered the proceeding extensively. Several outlets, noting that the trial represented an unusual and deeply uncomfortable moment of institutional reckoning for the Laconia Police Department itself, forced publicly to confront the failures of its own original 1979 investigation, even as it simultaneously prosecuted the man that same investigation had failed to properly pursue 2 decades earlier. The Laconia Citizen, the local newspaper that had covered Robert's original 1980 trial and later his 1998 exoneration extensively, dedicated a special multi-part series to the case throughout the trial's proceedings, examining not only Walter Pruitt's prosecution but the broader systemic failures that had allowed an innocent man to serve 19 years while the true perpetrator remained entirely unexamined. The series, written by a veteran reporter who had covered the original 1980 trial as a young journalist, drew considerable regional attention and was later recognized with a state journalism award for its thorough, careful examination of the case's full and complicated history. Coverage the reporter herself later said represented the most personally meaningful work of her entire long career. Court officials arranged overflow seating in an adjacent room for several of the trial's most heavily attended days, a measure reflecting just how deeply the case had captured the attention of the wider Lakes region community. Robert Hayes himself attended portions of the trial, telling reporters outside the courthouse that he felt no particular satisfaction in Walter Pruitt's prosecution, only a quiet, complicated relief that Diane's own family might finally receive the truth they had waited 19 years entirely unknowingly to actually possess. Robert declined to testify at the trial himself, telling Patricia Levesque privately that he had already spent 19 years of his life bound up in this particular courtroom's business and preferred, this time, simply to witness rather than participate in whatever came next. Diane's parents, both still living in Laconia, attended every day of the trial, telling reporters that the previous 19 years of believing justice had already been served made this particular reckoning all the more difficult, a strange and painful reopening of a grief they had believed, however mistakenly, they had already fully processed. The prosecution built its case around the DNA evidence, conclusively linking Walter Pruitt to the crime scene, his own formal confession, and the newly re-examined original case file demonstrating the clear inconsistencies in his 1979 statement that had gone entirely unpursued at the time. A forensic scientist testified at length about the DNA comparison process, explaining to the jury how the biological evidence originally believed to implicate Robert Hayes had, through decades of forensic advancement, ultimately proven to belong to an entirely different individual whose own interview had sat unexamined in the case file for nearly 20 years. The scientist also addressed the original fingerprint evidence directly, explaining that modern forensic understanding recognized far greater potential for partial print misidentification than analysts of 1979 had acknowledged, particularly given that Robert's own earlier, legitimate visits to Diane's apartment during their relationship provided an entirely innocent explanation for his print's presence that the original investigation had never adequately considered. The scientist also testified about the significant limitations of the hair comparison analysis used at Robert's original 1980 trial, explaining to the jury in accessible terms exactly why forensic science had since moved away from such techniques as a reliable means of individual identification, testimony that helped the jury understand precisely how an innocent man had come to be wrongfully convicted in the first place. The scientist noted specifically that national forensic standards organizations had, by the late 1990s, formally acknowledged that microscopic hair comparison alone could not reliably exclude or include a specific individual with anything approaching the scientific certainty prosecutors had confidently presented to Robert's original 1980 jury, a sobering acknowledgement of forensic science's own evolving and sometimes humbling understanding of its earlier limitations. Detective Kendrick herself testified about the painstaking process of reviewing the original file, explaining to the jury how a handful of small, unpursued inconsistencies in a routine witness interview had ultimately unraveled a case the department had considered closed for nearly 2 decades. Patricia Levesque also testified briefly regarding the DNA exclusion process that had led to Robert Hayes' exoneration, providing the jury with the full context necessary to understand how the very evidence that had once wrongfully convicted an innocent man had, through modern forensic advancement, ultimately identified the true perpetrator instead. The defense, arguing that Walter Pruitt's actions reflected a single moment of uncontrolled panic rather than premeditated murder, pressed on his otherwise unblemished record across the following 19 years, and on his own account of a sudden, unplanned confrontation. The defense attorney called a psychologist who suggested that Walter's decades of otherwise ordinary, quiet living reflected genuine remorse and successful suppression of a single uncharacteristic lapse in judgment, an argument the prosecution challenged directly by noting that Walter's continued silence throughout Robert Hayes' entire 19-year imprisonment reflected not remorse, but a sustained, deliberate choice to protect his own freedom at the direct expense of an innocent man's entire adult life. But the prosecution countered forcefully with the sustained nature of the violence itself, and with 19 years of calculated silence, during which Walter Pruitt had watched an innocent man serve a lengthy prison sentence for a crime he alone had committed. Evidence, the prosecution argued, reflected a depth of moral culpability that transcended even the underlying act of violence itself. The prosecutor reminded the jury in closing argument that Walter Pruitt had continued working in the same small downtown district for nearly 2 decades, had likely crossed paths on countless occasions with Diane's own grieving family, and had said nothing, done nothing, choosing his own continued freedom over the truth an innocent man's entire adult life had been sacrificed to conceal. She reminded jurors as well that Walter had, in fact, been interviewed directly by investigators in the earliest days of the original 1979 case, meaning he had known from the very beginning that another man was being investigated for his own crime, and had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly across the following 2 decades, never once to come forward. The prosecutor closed by asking the jury to consider not only the violence Walter had inflicted upon Diane Whitcomb, but the second, quieter violence he had inflicted upon Robert Hayes through 19 years of calculated, unbroken silence. A dual harm she argued the jury's verdict needed to fully and completely acknowledge. After 7 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just under 9 hours before returning a verdict finding Walter Pruitt guilty of second-degree murder. Persuaded that the sustained violence and the decades of calculated silence that followed reflected a depth of culpability the defense's account of momentary panic could not adequately explain. The jury foreperson later told reporters outside the courthouse that the panel had found Walter's continued silence throughout Robert Hayes' entire imprisonment impossible to reconcile with any genuine claim of remorse, arguing among themselves that true remorse would have compelled him to come forward at some point across 19 years, rather than allowing an innocent man to serve the entirety of a wrongful sentence in his place. Several jurors noted afterward that Walter's own decision to remain in the same small downtown community where Diane's family continued to grieve, rather than relocating elsewhere, struck them as a particularly troubling demonstration of his willingness to prioritize his own comfort and freedom over any genuine acknowledgement of the harm his silence had caused. Judge Margaret Sullivan, addressing a packed courtroom at sentencing, told Walter Pruitt that he had not only taken Diane Whitcomb's life, but had allowed an innocent man to serve 19 years in prison for his own crime. A moral failure she described as compounding an already devastating act of violence with an almost unimaginable additional cruelty. She spoke at length about the particular weight of that compounded injustice, noting that the court could never fully separate Walter's original crime from the decades of silence that had allowed it to remain unresolved. Silence that had cost Robert Hayes nearly 2 decades of his own irreplaceable life. Judge Sullivan addressed Robert Hayes directly during the sentencing hearing as well, though he was not present that particular day, acknowledging for the court record that the state of New Hampshire owed him a debt it could never fully repay. A formal judicial acknowledgement that Patricia Levesque later said meant a great deal to Robert when she related to him, even in his absence from the courtroom that day. She sentenced him to life imprisonment, a sentence that drew a long, quiet exhale from the packed gallery, many of whom had struggled across the preceding months to fully comprehend the layered injustice the case had finally revealed. In the years since the trial, Laconia has slowly absorbed the full, difficult truth behind a case that had once seemed, for nearly 2 decades, entirely and tragically settled. Robert Hayes, following his 1998 exoneration, received formal compensation from the state of New Hampshire for his wrongful imprisonment, though he has said publicly in the years since that no financial settlement could ever fully account for 19 years permanently lost, the relationships he never had the chance to build, the career he was never able to pursue, and the simple, ordinary freedoms most people never think to appreciate until they have been entirely taken away. He has become, since his release, a dedicated advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking regularly at universities and legal conferences across New England about the dangers of relying on forensic techniques not yet fully validated by rigorous scientific standards, and about the particular vulnerability faced by defendants who lack the resources to mount a thorough defense against confident, if ultimately mistaken, expert testimony. Robert has testified before the New Hampshire State Legislature on several occasions in support of criminal justice reform measures, drawing directly on his own experience to advocate for improved funding for indigent defense and for stricter scientific standards governing the forensic testimony permitted in criminal trials. His testimony before a state legislative committee in 2003 proved particularly influential, several lawmakers later crediting his personal account with helping secure passage of legislation requiring greater judicial scrutiny of forensic testimony methods not yet validated by rigorous, peer-reviewed scientific standards. A legacy Robert has said represents exactly the kind of concrete, lasting change he hopes his own painful ordeal might ultimately help achieve for others facing similar circumstances in the future. The legislation, which came to be informally known among New Hampshire legal circles as reflecting lessons learned directly from Robert's own case, has since been cited as a model by advocacy organizations in several neighboring states considering similar forensic evidence reforms of their own, a ripple effect of institutional change that Robert has said gives him genuine hope that his own 19 lost years might ultimately help prevent similar injustices from occurring elsewhere in the future. He eventually returned to construction work for a time following his release, telling a reporter that the simple, physical labor helped him reconnect with an ordinary sense of purpose after 19 years of institutional confinement, though he has since transitioned primarily into his advocacy work. Finding in it a sense of meaning, he says, helps transform his own devastating loss into something that might yet protect others from a similarly wrongful conviction. Robert has said that returning to a job site for the first time after his release proved surprisingly emotional. The ordinary rhythm of physical work triggering memories of the life and career he had once expected to build for himself before that October night in 1979 changed everything so completely and unjustly. Eleanor Hayes lived to see her son's exoneration, passing away peacefully 4 years later, having spent the final years of her own long life finally free of the particular anguish that had defined nearly 2 decades of faithful monthly visits to a prison holding a son she never once stopped believing was innocent. Eleanor spent those final 4 years living near her son for the first time in nearly 2 decades. And Robert has said that the simple, ordinary experience of sharing Sunday dinners with his mother again, an experience so many people take entirely for granted, remained among the most precious of his entire life following his release. He has described those Sunday dinners in his advocacy speeches as a small, sacred ritual the two of them protected fiercely across her final 4 years, rarely missing a single week, regardless of Robert's growing travel schedule for his advocacy work. A testament, he has said, to just how deeply both of them understood the preciousness of ordinary time together after 19 years spent able to see one another only through prison visiting room glass. She attended several of his early advocacy speeches personally, sitting quietly in the audience with what friends described as an unmistakable, quiet pride, telling one of Robert's fellow advocates shortly before her own passing that she had always believed her son's story would someday help protect other innocent people from suffering as he had, a hope she lived just long enough to see beginning to bear fruit. Robert has said that his mother's unwavering faith across those 19 years remains the single most important sustaining force of his entire ordeal, a devotion he has spoken about often in his advocacy work, encouraging families of the wrongfully convicted never to abandon hope, even when the legal system itself seems entirely unmoved by their pleas. Detective Kendrick, whose careful re-examination of the original case file ultimately identified Diane Whitcomb's true killer, has continued her work within the Laconia Police Department's Cold Case Division, and has spoken publicly about the particular responsibility she feels toward ensuring that every witness statement, however routine it may initially appear, receives the same rigorous scrutiny that might have prevented Robert Hayes's wrongful conviction entirely had it been applied from the very beginning in 1979. She has since worked with the department to develop new training protocols for cold case re-examination, specifically emphasizing the danger of investigative tunnel vision, using the Whitcomb case directly as a teaching example of how quickly focusing exclusively on a single suspect can allow other significant leads to go entirely unexamined. The training program Detective Kendrick helped develop has since been adopted by several other New Hampshire police departments as well, incorporating detailed case study materials drawn directly from the Whitcomb investigation to illustrate, in concrete and unforgettable terms, exactly how institutional pressure to resolve a case quickly can sometimes come at the devastating cost of a genuinely thorough and impartial investigation. Detective Kendrick has said that presenting this training material to rooms full of younger officers remains one of the most meaningful aspects of her own continuing career, a way of ensuring that the specific painful lessons of the Whitcomb case continue actively protecting future defendants long after the case itself has passed from immediate public memory. Detective Kendrick has said in interviews since the trial that she thinks often of the particular weight of her own role in the case, aware that her careful, patient reading of a decades-old file had, in a very real sense, corrected an institutional failure that had cost an innocent man 19 years of his own life. Responsibility, she says, she carries into every subsequent case her division reviews. She has also spoken candidly about the discomfort of investigating and, in effect, correcting the work of a former colleague within her own department, telling a reporter that she approached the process not with any desire to condemn Detective Boudreau personally, but simply to ensure that the truth, however uncomfortable, was finally and fully brought to light. Detective Kendrick has said that she came to understand Boudreau's own failures not as evidence of malice, but as a cautionary illustration of how easily good intentions, combined with genuine institutional and public pressure to resolve a devastating crime quickly, can lead even a dedicated investigator toward conclusions that a more patient, less pressured process might never have reached, a nuanced understanding she has tried to carry into her own approach to every subsequent case. Diane Whitcomb's parents have said in the years since Walter Pruitt's conviction that learning the full truth of their daughter's death brought a complicated mixture of relief and renewed grief. Finally understanding after 2 decades exactly what had happened to her, while simultaneously confronting the painful knowledge that an innocent man had suffered so profoundly in the meantime for a crime that was never his. Diane's mother told a reporter that she had spent nearly 20 years believing, with what she now recognized as misplaced certainty, that she understood the full story of her daughter's death, and that learning otherwise required her to essentially grieve Diane a second time, this time with the added, painful weight of understanding how badly the original investigation had failed both her daughter and an entirely innocent man simultaneously. She described struggling in the months following Walter Pruitt's trial, with a complicated anger she had not expected to feel toward the original investigators, ultimately finding a measure of peace only once she came to understand, through her own growing friendship with Robert Hayes, that both her family and his had ultimately been failed by the same flawed process, a shared injustice that she said helped her move beyond anger toward a more complete and ultimately more meaningful understanding of everything the case had truly cost. They have since become quiet supporters of Robert Hayes' own advocacy work, telling a local reporter that they consider his exoneration and his daughter's own long-delayed justice to be two halves of the very same story, a story that could only be made whole once both the wrongful conviction and the true crime had finally, fully, been brought into the light together. Diane's father attended several of Robert's early advocacy speeches personally, and the two men, bound together by the same case in such different ways, developed what both later described as an unexpected but genuinely meaningful friendship in the years following the trial, each finding in the other someone who fully understood the particular, layered weight of everything the case had ultimately revealed. The two men have since spoken together publicly on several occasions, appearing jointly at community forums to discuss the case from their own distinct but ultimately intertwined perspectives, a pairing that audiences have consistently found among the most powerful and moving presentations either man has given individually, the victim's father and the wrongfully convicted man standing together as living testament to a single tragedy's full and complicated truth. To the younger generations coming of age in communities like Laconia, and in small towns across this country very much like it, the story of Robert Hayes carries a quiet but essential lesson about the fallibility of even well-intentioned investigations, about how the pressure to resolve a devastating crime quickly can sometimes lead investigators to settle too readily on the most immediately available suspect, rather than pursuing every lead with equal and sustained rigor. Detective Kendrick has spoken about this lesson often since the trial, telling young investigators that the case taught her an enduring respect for the discipline of examining every available lead with equal seriousness, regardless of how quickly one particular suspect might seem to explain the available evidence. It is a lesson, too, about the particular courage required to maintain one's innocence across 19 years of imprisonment, about Eleanor Hayes' own unwavering monthly visits, and about the eventual, hard-won vindication that patient, persistent advocacy, both from Robert himself and from the attorneys and scientists who finally took up his cause, ultimately made possible. Robert Hayes has spoken often, in his continuing advocacy work, about the particular importance of never assuming that a conviction, however confidently secured, represents the full and final truth of any case, insisting that the justice system's own occasional failures deserve exactly the same rigorous scrutiny and eventual correction as any other unsolved mystery. He has told university audiences across New England that his own story is not meant to inspire distrust of the justice system entirely, but rather a clear-eyed understanding that the system, staffed as it is by fallible human beings working under real and sometimes overwhelming pressure, requires constant vigilance and ongoing scientific rigor to fulfill its own stated promise of truth and fairness. Robert has spoken at more than 40 universities and legal conferences across the region in the years since his release, and law professors who have invited him to speak to their own students consistently describe his talks as among the most impactful guest lectures their students ever encounter. The abstract legal concept of wrongful conviction suddenly rendered vividly and unforgettably human through Robert's own quiet, measured recounting of 19 lost years. One criminal law professor at a New Hampshire university, who has invited Robert to speak to her own students every year for over a decade, told a reporter that student evaluations consistently cite his lecture as the single most memorable experience of their entire legal education. A testament, she said, to the particular power of hearing directly from someone who lived through exactly the kind of systemic failure their textbooks could only describe in abstract clinical terms. Patricia Levesque, reflecting on the case in interviews since the trial, has said she hopes young people entering the legal profession understand that patient, persistent advocacy on behalf of a single client, sustained across years of setback and disappointment, can still, in the end, correct even the most entrenched and seemingly settled injustice. She has continued her work with the Innocence Project in the years since, taking on dozens of additional cases and helping secure several further exonerations across New England, though she has said publicly on more than one occasion that Robert Hayes' case remains the one that most profoundly shaped her own understanding of exactly why this difficult, often frustrating work matters as much as it does. Laconia today remains the same quiet Lakes region community it always was, its Milltown streets and church steeples still catching the same golden autumn light each October. The department store where Diane once worked closed its doors many years ago, its downtown building since repurposed for other retail use. Though longtime Laconia residents still occasionally point out the corner where it once stood whenever the subject of the city's own difficult history comes up in conversation. The building now houses a small collection of local boutiques and a coffee shop, and the current owners, upon learning the history of the property from a longtime customer some years ago, arranged a small unmarked plaque near the entrance simply reading Diane's name and the years of her life. A quiet, private gesture the business owners have said they felt was simply the right thing to do once they learned the full story of the young woman who had once worked within those same walls. Church Street, where Diane's apartment building still stands today, remains a quiet residential block much as it always was, new families having long since moved into the same modest second-floor apartments where a young woman's ordinary evening once ended in a violence that would take 19 years, and the wrongful conviction of an innocent man to finally and fully resolve. A small memorial bench, funded jointly by Diane's family and by a group of Robert Hayes' own advocacy supporters, was installed near the building's entrance several years after Walter Pruitt's conviction, bearing a simple inscription honoring both Diane's memory and the broader lesson of the case, a quiet, shared act of remembrance that longtime residents say reflects the full, complicated truth the community ultimately came to understand about its own history. The bench's dedication ceremony, attended by both the Whitcomb and Hayes families together, drew a modest but deeply moved crowd of longtime Laconia residents, many of whom had followed the case across its full 20-year arc from the original 1980 conviction through the eventual 1999 trial that finally brought the complete truth into the light. A shared community moment several attendees later described as the closest thing the city had experienced to a genuine collective reckoning with its own difficult past. But it is also now a community that finally understands the whole of its own story, one where a wrongfully convicted man's stolen years and a young woman's long-delayed justice are both at last fully and permanently acknowledged, a truth that took 19 years to surface, but that has now completely and irreversibly come into the light. Before you go, if you find value and appreciate this story, please consider hitting subscribe and like the video, and turn on notifications too, so you don't miss the next interesting dramatized solved cold case video. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.